Greetings ladies and gentlefish, and welcome to another video where I'm just going to be talking about something not computer game related. Arguably something a little more serious, but we'll see how it goes. You may remember a short while ago I did one looking at the very mundane topic of defining a word, but it was still irritating to me because lots of people just misunderstand it and use that as a basis for making some rather dodgy claims and dodgy arguments. So, yes. On that subject as well, the last time I did a video like this, looking at the definition for the word theory, the YouTube algorithm ate it, spat it out, and decided it didn't need monetization. Which was vaguely irritating, as the topic itself was fairly benign, and I struggled to see how you could claim it was controversial in any way. To give YouTube credit, I did submit the video for a manual review, and despite not technically having enough views to qualify for such, YouTube did actually manually review it and came to the conclusion that the video was fine. But it does rather raise questions about YouTube's algorithm and how it affects various creators. I don't rely on this for an income in any way, shape or form, but for those content creators who do, and especially those who may be making videos that are on more controversial topics, or at least topics that are not fashionable to talk about at the moment, that does seem to be a little bit of a low blow for them, potentially. But we shall see how it goes. It will be interesting to see whether this video survives the demonetization process or not. Fair warning, by the way, we're going to be talking about crime statistics. If that's something that either bores you or bothers you, then feel free to not watch, but just wanted to get that disclaimer out there. So, the rationale behind this, well, over the last few years in particular, I've noticed that you tend to find it difficult, or I tend to find it difficult, to distinguish between claims made by people or media organisations and the actual facts of the matter. They tend to get rather blurred, rather fuzzy, and the truth doesn't appear to be a lot of people's priority anymore, which I find a little concerning. People often seem to be far more interested in weaving some sort of narrative and making the facts fit that narrative rather than just telling you the truth. Now, I'm not saying this is anything new, but it does seem to be on the increase lately, whether you are talking about media outlets, or whether you are talking about individuals, whether you are talking about politicians, the list goes on. So what I'm going to attempt to do here is be a little bit more objective about things. I'm going to try to actually use some data, I know, shock and awe, and see where that goes. So, we're going to be having a look at some crime statistics. And remember, we're trying to do this with the objective of finding out what's true, rather than trying to unpick who's out to get us. We're trying to get away from all that tinfoil hattery. We're trying to actually get some data. We're going to be looking at the claims of two groups of individuals. So there is a radio show, podcast, YouTube channel, Louder with Crowder. It's an American chap. And he made a claim a little while ago that struck me as being a bit dubious, and of course Donald Trump has made many claims that many people have argued over an awful lot, but we're just going to pick up on one of them. And part of the reason for doing this, on top of what I've already explained, is that, well, have you ever been in that situation where you hear someone say something and you think, really? Are you sure? That doesn't sound right. Well, I was in that situation. So, I thought it worth testing by looking up some actual data and some information and some facts, and seeing if we can get to the bottom of this. Now, first up, we have Louder with Crowder. Now, this is a right-wing, or would often be considered a more right-wing, let me rephrase, American, as I mentioned, podcast, radio show, YouTube channel thing. He often discusses a lot of points that would be considered either controversial or unfashionable. And often he tries to put forward a debate, or he claims to try to put forward a debate or an opinion based on facts. Then this comment came out in one particular conversation, and he said words to the effect that you don't in the United Kingdom have the right to defend yourself. Now this is a topic that rears its ugly head a couple of times, and especially when you're talking about topics such as gun control, it's fairly common that people compare the US and the UK, because culturally the two countries are not miles apart. I mean, there are definitely differences, of course, but they are both Western, English speaking, etc., etc. There is quite a lot of commonality there. In America, guns are a lot more prevalent than they are in the United Kingdom. And so this topic comes up, and one comment that was made by Crowder was that you don't have the right to defend yourself in the UK, which immediately set off alarm bells for me, because that's just not true. Now, it does get mentioned, the topic comes up a few times when you hear of cases where, for example, a few years ago there was a farmer and some people came onto his land. They were trying to steal from him. They stole something, ran away, and one particular individual was running away from the farmer. The farmer shoots him in the back with a shotgun, and the farmer gets put in prison as a result for shooting the guy in the back. And so you get this argument that you don't have the right to defend yourself in the UK. Now this argument is untrue. I'm going to show you the little bit that demonstrates it's untrue in just a moment. But just to be fair, when I was looking up some information for this, I did come across one thing that rather surprised me, and that was the number of firearms that are owned in each respective country. So I think there's rather this reputation that America, you have lots and lots of firearms, and Britain, you have no firearms, they don't exist. Well, that's not quite true. Now, it is true to say that in America there are a lot of guns. In fact, if you look up the numbers, there is almost one gun per American citizen, which is quite a lot. Bearing in mind that includes children, for example. That's quite a lot of firearms. Now, in the UK, it is nowhere near that number, but it is more than I expected. And actually, there are far more acceptable reasons to own a gun than I had thought. Now, that's not really relevant to this particular issue, but I just thought it was worth mentioning, as I did find it out, so in the sake of openness and all that jazz. Getting back to the issue at hand, if you actually look up the law regarding this issue, you can see, 1, why this misconception occurs, and 2, you can see why it's basically wrong. So, this is from the United Kingdom's government website, under the section called Using Reasonable Force Against Intruders. And it says, and I quote, "You can use reasonable force to protect yourself or others if a crime is taking place inside your home. This means you can protect yourself in the heat of the moment. This includes using an object as a weapon. Stop an intruder running off, for example, by tackling them to the ground. There's no specific definition of reasonable force. It depends on the circumstances. If you only did what you honestly thought was necessary at the time, this would provide strong evidence that you acted within the law. Read the guidance from the Crown Prosecution Service. You do not have to wait to be attacked before defending yourself in your home. However, you could be prosecuted if, for example, you carry on attacking the intruder even if you're no longer in danger, or you pre-plan a trap for someone rather than involve the police. So essentially, the position of the law is that you have the right to defend yourself and your home. The only time when you are likely going to get prosecuted is if you continue, quote-unquote, defending yourself when there is no longer a need. So to go back to the early example, the farmer who shot the person as they were in his home, he got prosecuted not because he shot the person, but because he shot the person while they were running away from him, and he shot them in the back. So the person was considered to no longer be a threat to him, and therefore he should not have shot them. Now, you can argue over exactly under which circumstances you should or should not be able to defend yourself, for want of a better phrase. And I believe this law has been left intentionally vague, as it says there is no specific definition for reasonable force. And I think that is because there are a large plethora of different circumstances where someone could find themselves in. And I think, and this is my interpretation, but I think it is left intentionally vague so that each situation can be treated on a very case-by-case basis. That would be my interpretation, at least. Now, for the exact question in hand, or the issue, you do not have the right to defend yourself. That is patently incorrect. You could say that you think that the homeowner in this situation should be given more, or indeed less, right to defend themselves, but that's a slightly separate issue. The fact remains that you do indeed have the right to defend yourself in the United Kingdom, as I imagine you do in many different countries. So this one is pretty easy to put to bed. And this is also the sort of situation where, honestly, I'm surprised that someone who makes such a fuss about doing their research didn't do their research. But there it is. We'll leave it as it is. The second one is a bit less straightforward. So the second point is a claim made by Donald Trump, that pillar of American society. And he said, essentially, there is more violent crime in the United Kingdom than the US. Once again, the comparison between the two countries is often made with the cultural similarities and so on. There's more violent crime in the UK than the US. Now this one was not quite as obvious to me, but I did genuinely want to go and find out what I could about the subject. And so I did. Now, there were some issues that cropped up. So firstly, I would like to say, exactly as written, Donald Trump's claim is technically true. There are a greater number of instances of violent crime in the United Kingdom than there are in the United States. And that actually sounds even worse when you consider that United Kingdom has a smaller population than the United States. So that's an even higher incidence of violent crime per person. However, each country uses a different definition for what counts as violent crime. In the United States, it is quite clearly laid out and defined as a set, discrete list of crimes. Each one of these crimes comes under the category of violent crime. In the United Kingdom, it is much less clearly defined, and that makes the variety of crimes that can be categorized as violent much broader. So in short, you're not comparing like for like. So the claim is technically true, but also at the same time it's rather misleading. So what I decided to do was take a smaller selection, a discrete selection of crimes that would be considered violent, and look at the data for those. And I decided to do it for a variety of different countries. So the idea is that if you can't really compare quote-unquote violent crime because the definitions are quite different, if you can find crimes where the definitions are much more similar to each other, then hopefully you can make a more informed judgment about the respective crime rates in each country. And in order to get a comparison going, I also included some continental European countries into the analysis. So just a quick point about data sources before we get on to what I actually dug up. So for the UK, I got my data from the Office for National Statistics. So it's a fairly trustworthy source, but this should come with the disclaimer that in the United Kingdom, for those that are not aware, the country is devolved to certain degrees. So the crime statistics are not actually reported for the entirety of the United Kingdom. They're instead reported for different bits of the United Kingdom. So the data that I have used is for England and Wales. So it does not include the data for Scotland or Northern Ireland. Now, I think this is not an unreasonable position to take, as between them, England and Wales compose the majority of the United Kingdom's population. It's something like, of the UK's roughly 70 million people, and I'm rounding there, I appreciate it's not exactly 70 million people, around about 58 million live in England and Wales. The populations of Northern Ireland and Scotland are relatively small. In fact, the population of the United Kingdom is dominated by England, if we're going to be honest, but never mind. So, This data, whilst it's technically not for the United Kingdom, it's only for England and Wales, it should still be fairly representative of the country as a whole. That data was available when I got it from 2017. For the United States, I took the data from the FBI. Again, the data is available from 2017, so it should be relatively easy to compare those two. Now, it was more difficult to find data for the other countries in this comparison. Partly, I imagine, because of language barriers, but honestly, I found it more difficult to find an official source for crime statistic data for France, Germany, Sweden. I even looked at Canada at one point for the sake of comparison, and the Canadian data was a nightmare, which is why I have not included it here. So I ended up using a website that I've included there, and I'm probably going to mispronounce this, noma.com, is it a silent K? Either way. This collates crime data from a variety of different countries, a wide variety of different countries across the world, and tries to put them in one place. Now, for the sake of verification, I actually compared the data on this website with the data from the Office for National Statistics and from the FBI for America and England and Wales respectively, and that seemed to be where the website got its data from for those two countries, so I'm going to assume it is reliable for the other three countries in this comparison, namely France, Germany and Sweden. The other thing to note at this point is that the data available for France, Germany and Sweden is from 2015. Now, that is not very old, it is only different by a couple of years compared with the other two countries, but we are going to come back to that later as a potential problem, but let's just shelve that idea for the moment. So I considered 4 what would be considered violent crimes, and we're going to go through those in sequence, and we're going to try and make a comparison between these 5 nations and try and see if we can come to some sort of conclusion about which countries have the higher incidence of crime, essentially. So to start off with, we're looking at homicide, murders of people. Now, I have scaled each of these graphs so that we're showing the rate of that particular crime per million people. So this means the data should not be skewed by one country having a much larger population or a much smaller population than the others. For the sake of interest in this particular comparison, Sweden is by far and away the least populous country, and America, the United States, by far and away the most populous country, with England, France and Germany, England and Wales I should say, France and Germany, whilst not having identical populations, they're much more similar than the other two. What we find is that the highest homicide rate by far is found in the United States. The lowest homicide rate in this comparison is found in Germany, but honestly, all 4 of those European countries, they're much more similar. So, England and Wales, France, Germany and Sweden all have homicide rates of between 8 and 16 per million people. In the United States, it's over 50. So the United States has by far and away the highest homicide rate of these nations, which I found interesting. Because the argument that is often made is that crime in the United States will be lower because of the higher prevalence of firearms. That doesn't appear to be played out by this, at least in homicides. Let's look at some of the others. The second crime I decided to look at was rape. Again, we're picking violent crimes, they're going to be quite unpleasant. This is a more even comparison, but there are still some large discrepancies. So the most notable one being that England and Wales here have have the highest, let's not say by far and away, they have the highest rape incident rate per million people, over 700. Sweden comes in at second. Germany easily wins this category, winning once again with a rape rate of less than 100 per million people for the year being considered here. France also comes out fairly well, and the United States find itself kind of somewhere in the middle of all this. But Germany is the winner here, England and Wales the loser, by a little bit of a margin. Third crime that I considered was robbery. Here we have France coming out at the bottom of the pile, with Germany once again winning this category, if you wish. It has the lowest robbery incident rate per million people, and then the other three nations coming out kind of similar to each other, but being in the middle of the other two. Finally, we have burglary rate, and this time it's Sweden that really gets a bit of a kicking and has the worst burglary rate in this comparison. The United States has the lowest burglary rate in this comparison. Germany and France being pretty much neck and neck for second place, Germany just pipping France to the post, and England and Wales having the second worst in this comparison. So this is where we could have a look at these four graphs and make some really pithy comment about if you want to be burgled, you go to Sweden, etc. However, do you remember earlier on I mentioned that the data for England and Wales and for the United States were taken from 2017, and for the European countries it was from 2015? Yeah, there are some issues with this data that we really need to take a look at. So, the fact that continental Europe data was from 2015 means that it is not including the supposed spike in crime that occurred after the influx of refugees from the Middle East, among other places. So any increase in crime due to that is not going to be included. And as far as I can work out from having done a little bit of research, that did cause an increase in crime rate, although please do take that conclusion with a bit of a pinch of salt. So the data for England and Wales will have included that. The data for continental Europe will not, and America, well, it's not really an American issue, although they've had their own refugee problems. Not this particular one. In fact, the country that should be, or that you would expect to be most affected by this is perhaps Germany, as they have been taking on the largest number of refugees. But anyway, that is speculation. All I am pointing out here is that the data being taken from different years does bring in a bit of a problem with this comparison. Secondly, even if you look at the data as presented, if you go back and look at the raw data, there is a lot of variation year on year. Now, I have only used data taken from particular years, that's giving you a 12-month snapshot, but given there's so much variation, you could take the crime rates from different years and you might end up with some quite different results. In fact, I did initially actually do the comparison between the United States and England and Wales with data taken from 2011, and well, it was much... The United States did not come out of that comparison looking good, let's put it that way. But obviously time passes and fluctuations occur, so again, it's a point that I think is worth bearing in mind. Finally, you have to remember that not every crime is reported, and unfortunately different countries, and indeed different cultures, are more or less likely to report a crime occurring. Now, the data that I've presented so far is just the crime that is reported. Now, this is where we are going to start getting very deep into speculation. The crime reported, you can try and take that data and reproduce the amount of crime that actually happened by surveying people and trying to get some sort of idea of the percentage of crimes that are not reported. Now, this data does exist, and I have done this comparison for the United States compared with England and Wales, and I'm going to show it to you, but I would very much like to stress that this should be taken with a large pinch of salt. I would not trust this very far. And what it does mean is that by this metric, if this is correct, the United States has a relatively low crime reporting rate, which means that considerably more crimes end up happening than are actually reported. So, For the next 4 graphs, you're going to look at data comparing just the United States with England and Wales. And this data has been modified to try and account for the difference in likelihood of a crime being reported in each of those countries. The idea being that this should perhaps give you a better idea for the actual crime occurrence rate rather than the crime reporting rate. Again, we're going to go through each of these 4 violent crimes in turn. So, firstly, homicide. Now, this was already skewed one way. The United States, even from the previous set of data, had by far and away the highest homicide rate, and this just makes the gap even larger. In fact, if this is to be believed, the homicide rate in the United States is approximately 10 times what it is in England and Wales. Now, I have excluded from each of these graphs the data for the 3 European countries because of the fact that they're from a different year. England and Wales and the United States, at least this data is from 2017. But anyway, so this further exacerbates the homicide problem in the United States. Next up, well, we have the rape incident rate. Now, there is still a gap here, but it has been closed considerably, and actually, if you look at this, in order to show any difference in the 2 bars here, I've actually had to zoom the axis in quite a lot. So this axis actually only goes from 2002 to 2009 incidents per million people. So the United States, you're looking at just under 2005 incidents per million people, and England and Wales just over 2008. So they're very, very similar. If I were to have plotted this on a scale going from 0 to 2009, for instance, the difference is negligible. So essentially, by including this statistic, the rape occurrence rate in the United States and England and Wales is, to all intents and purposes, the same. So the argument that rapes are less common because of the greater prevalence of firearms, if this is correct, appears to not really be true. Third, we have robberies per million people, and again, this seems to go very much against the United States. So we have England and Wales, just under 3,000 robberies per million people for the year of 2017. The United States, over 4,500 robberies per million people. And the last graphic, well, it's looking kind of similar. Burglaries per million people. England and Wales, just under 19,000. The United States, just over 20,500. Again, I've zoomed in on this axis a little bit. These, if you plot them on a full axis, don't look quite as different as this. So, if you try and account for the fact that different countries report crimes differently, or our people in those countries are more or less likely to report crimes, the fact that in the United States, purportedly, crimes are less likely to be reported tends to skew these figures against the United States. But I would like once again to say this should be taken with a bucket of salt. I'm not sure how much I trust these surveys. So, after all this, what kind of conclusions can you come to? So firstly, let's just go back. The comment made by Crowder back in his video, that is just incorrect, and it does not take much digging to find out, to be fair, both why it is incorrect and also why some people might have the wrong impression of it, just because what counts as a reasonable force is poorly defined, and I would argue probably intentionally so. Now, the Trump statements are more interesting and problematic. Again, Trump is technically correct when he says there is a higher occurrence of violent crime in the United Kingdom than in the United States. But because the two countries define violent crime differently, it's also a very misleading comparison. You're not comparing like for like. And really, that's the one thing that I came away from this with. Crime statistics are incredibly messy. You're looking at the number of crimes being reported rather than the number of crimes that are actually occurring. Different countries define crimes differently whilst using some fairly similar language. And really, it's just very, very difficult to make any sort of meaningful comparison between crime statistics in different countries, or perhaps in different states if you live in the United States, or different counties or something if you live in the United Kingdom or in another country. So, it's messy. And my takeaway message from this would be that you should be very, very skeptical, very suspicious of what anybody tells you about crime statistics, but about statistics to do with society in general. They are very open to interpretation and very open to people fiddling the statistic just a little bit to show what they want it to show, and not necessarily telling you the whole story. But to go back to the statement that Trump originally made, that violent crime is less prevalent in the United States than in the United Kingdom, and the implications that go with, I would say that is not a statement that a responsible individual could make with any confidence. But there we go. It is what it is. Hopefully, you found it vaguely informative. Possibly a little bit enlightening. Really, the one takeaway from this I would like people to get is just to engage their own brain, their own mind, their own critical faculties, and work out what's going on for yourself. Fact check. If you hear someone make a claim, look it up. And don't just look for the data that supports your own opinion. Look for data that isn't going to support your own opinion, and come to your own judgment. Be intelligent about it. Check things. And when you're looking at graphs, always have a look for what's written on the axes. I showed a graph there where it looked like the difference between two things was quite large, but in order to show that difference I'd had to zoom in quite a lot on the axis, and actually the difference between the two, not very meaningful. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed, possibly found it vaguely informative. If you did, by all means feel free to catch some of my other videos. I am planning some other more factual videos rather than just computer games related, but don't worry, I'm not leaving computer games to one side. And either way, I hope you're having a very nice Sunday as I'm recording this, and I hope you're enjoying what you're doing, and I'll catch you guys the next time. Ciao, ciao.